When I legally purchased an old mill lake, I expected paperwork, not police sirens. But the HOA saw the water and panicked. Within days, they dialed 911, claiming authority over land and water they didn't own. What they didn't know, federal waterway codes were about to shut them out completely. When the HOA first claimed authority over the old mill lake, their confidence was almost impressive. They spoke in absolute terms: community jurisdiction, shared resources, HOA-controlled land. To them, the presence of water automatically meant control. What they failed to understand was that water is not treated like lawns, sidewalks, or parking lots under U.S. law, especially not water with historical and federal significance. The lake I purchased wasn't a decorative pond dug by a developer 20 years ago. It was an old mill lake, created over a century ago to power industrial machinery. That single fact changed everything. Old mill lakes are often tied to historic waterways, and many fall under federal waterway classifications, even when they appear small, quiet, or locally forgotten. The HOA didn't research any of this. They didn't consult federal maps, historical land grants, or waterway registries. They relied on assumption, and assumption is the weakest legal foundation there is. The HOA's mistake: confusing proximity with authority. From the HOA's perspective, the lake sat near their community, so they believed it belonged, at least partially, to them. They cited HOA bylaws, claiming residents had shared interest in the lake's appearance, access, and use. But HOA bylaws stop where federal jurisdiction begins. Federal waterway codes are not optional. They override local ordinances, county regulations, and especially private HOA rules. Once a body of water is classified as federally protected, or connected to a protected system, no HOA has enforcement power over it. That's where their entire argument collapsed. What makes an old mill lake federally protected? Old mill lakes often connect to streams, rivers, or drainage systems that feed into navigable waters. Over decades, these connections establish federal interest, even if the lake looks isolated today. In this case, historical surveys showed the lake was created before the HOA even existed. It fed into a downstream waterway listed on federal maps. It had been referenced in historical mill operation permits. It appeared in archived environmental records. That meant the lake fell under federal waterway oversight, not private community governance. The HOA didn't want to hear that. Threats, letters, and fake authority. Once the HOA realized I wasn't complying with their demands, the tone changed. What started as friendly reminders turned into official-looking notices, warnings about fines, and claims that I was violating community environmental standards. They demanded access rights, usage restrictions, maintenance compliance, permission for HOA inspections, none of which they were legally entitled to. Every letter they sent made one fatal mistake: they asserted authority they didn't have. And in legal disputes, false authority doesn't just weaken your case, it exposes you to liability. The 911 call that backfired. Unable to intimidate me into submission, the HOA escalated dramatically. They called 911, reporting a disturbance, and claiming unauthorized activity on community-controlled water. That call triggered law enforcement involvement, but not in the way they expected. When officers arrived, they asked the most important question first. Who owns the lake? I presented the deed. The boundaries were clear. The ownership was unquestionable. Then came the second question. Is this waterway federally classified? That's when everything shifted. Federal codes trump HOA rules. Once federal classification entered the discussion, the HOA's presence became irrelevant. Officers contacted appropriate agencies. Records were checked. Maps were reviewed. And the conclusion was simple. The HOA had zero jurisdiction. Not partial. Not conditional. Zero. HOAs cannot regulate federally protected waterways. HOAs cannot enforce access. HOAs cannot dictate use. HOAs cannot call emergency services to assert false authority. The legal reality the HOA didn't expect. The HOA thought they were enforcing rules. In reality, they were misrepresenting ownership, misusing emergency services, interfering with federally protected property rights. Those actions carry consequences. Federal waterway law exists specifically to prevent local overreach. It ensures that water resources aren't fragmented by private interests or neighborhood politics. And it doesn't matter how loud or organized an HOA is, federal law always wins. Why this happens so often with HOAs? This situation isn't rare. HOAs frequently overstep because they rely on intimidation, not law. Residents often comply without questioning authority. Many people don't know federal protections exist. HOAs assume no one will challenge them. But when someone does challenge them, with documentation, patience, and legal awareness, their power evaporates quickly. The aftermath. Once the federal classification was confirmed, the HOA went silent. No more letters. No more threats. No more claims of authority. The same board that once spoke in absolutes suddenly avoided all communication. The lake remained mine. The rights remained protected. The law stood firm. The lesson. This case proves a critical truth. HOAs only have power when people believe they do. Federal waterway codes exist to protect landowners from exactly this kind of overreach. And when those codes are invoked, even the most aggressive HOA has no choice but to step back. They called 911 expecting control. Instead, they exposed their own limits. When the HOA decided to call 911, they believed they had found the ultimate pressure tactic. In their minds, police involvement would instantly legitimize their claims and force compliance. For years, that strategy had worked on residents who didn't know the difference between HOA bylaws and actual law. This time, however, they made a critical miscalculation. They escalated the situation into a realm where facts, records, and federal authority mattered more than intimidation. The moment the sirens arrived, the sound of sirens echoed across the old mill lake, drawing attention from nearby homes. From the HOA's point of view, this was a public display of power. From a legal standpoint, it was the beginning of their collapse. When law enforcement arrived, they didn't take sides. They asked questions. Calm, direct, procedural questions. That alone disrupted the HOA's narrative, because intimidation doesn't survive scrutiny. The first claim the HOA made was predictable. This lake is under community control. The officers didn't accept the statement at face value. They asked for proof. Ownership versus assumption. The HOA had none. I presented my deed, property survey, and purchase records. The boundaries were precise. The lake sat entirely within them. That fact alone dismantled half of the HOA's argument. But ownership wasn't the final nail in the coffin. It was the classification of the water. The question that changed everything. One officer asked a simple question that the HOA clearly hadn't prepared for. Is this a federally recognized waterway? That single question shifted the entire dynamic. The HOA board members exchanged glances. They didn't know. They had never checked. Their authority had been built on confidence, not confirmation. When federal law enters the scene, federal waterway codes are not abstract concepts. They are enforceable, documented, and binding. When there is even a possibility that a water body falls under federal jurisdiction, local enforcement must step back and verify. Officers contacted relevant agencies. Historical and environmental records were reviewed. Archived maps were referenced. What emerged was undeniable. The old mill lake was connected to a federally regulated water system. At that moment, the HOA ceased to be a governing force. Legally, they became bystanders. The misuse of emergency services. The most damaging consequence for the HOA wasn't the loss of authority, it was the misuse of 911. Emergency services exist to protect life and property, not to resolve private disputes or enforce imaginary jurisdiction. By calling 911 to assert control over property they didn't own and water they couldn't regulate, the HOA crossed a line. Law enforcement made that clear. The HOA representatives were informed that emergency calls must be based on legitimate threats. False claims of authority are taken seriously. Repeated misuse can result in penalties. What they intended as a show of power turned into a formal warning. From aggression to silence, the transformation was immediate. The HOA members who had been vocal, confrontational, and threatening minutes earlier suddenly had nothing to say. Their tone softened. Their posture changed. The confidence vanished. Because once federal jurisdiction is confirmed, there is nothing left to argue. HOA rules cannot override federal law. HOA boards cannot reinterpret federal codes. HOA enforcement stops at the boundary of real authority. Why this backfired so badly? The HOA made 3 critical errors. They assumed control without verification. They escalated without understanding the law. They involved emergency services unnecessarily. Any one of those mistakes would have weakened their position. Together, they destroyed it. The legal protection of waterways. Federal waterway protections exist for a reason. Water does not conform to property lines, neighborhood boundaries, or HOA maps. It moves, connects, feeds ecosystems, and supports public interests. That's why water law is treated differently from land law. Once a waterway falls under federal protection, private organizations lose enforcement power. Access and usage are legally defined. Environmental and historical considerations take priority. The HOA never considered any of this. The aftermath. Quiet retreat. In the weeks following the incident, the HOA attempted damage control. Communications stopped. Notices were quietly withdrawn. Internal meetings were held, but no further action was taken. They didn't apologize. They didn't admit fault. They simply disappeared from the issue. And that silence spoke volumes. What this means for property owners. This story is a reminder that authority must be proven, not assumed. HOAs often operate in gray areas, relying on compliance rather than legality. But when confronted with federal law, those gray areas vanish. Property owners who understand their rights hold the real power. The final lesson. By calling 911, the HOA believed they were escalating toward victory. Instead, they escalated themselves out of relevance. Federal waterway codes didn't just protect my property, they exposed the limits of HOA power in the clearest way possible. They wanted control. They got a warning. And the law did the rest.